So today we're going to start looking at ratios. And the first thing we need to know is what exactly is a ratio? Well, a ratio is a comparison of two quantities. It's when we have two things and we want to compare how much there is of one compared to how much there is of another. And so some things we need to know about that are ratios can be written three different ways. The order in which we write the ratio is very important, and ratios can be simplified or they can be reduced, just like we do with fractions. Now, ratios and fractions are not the same thing, which I'll explain more in just a minute, but take a moment to make sure you understand those three concepts. They can be written three ways. The order in which we write the numbers is important, and they can be simplified or reduced. And another thing we need to know is there are two types of ratios. One type of ratio is part to part, where we're comparing one part of the group to another part of the group. Another type of ratio is a part to whole ratio. It's when we compare one part of the group to the whole group. And a part to whole group is really the only one that is kind of like a fraction, because it's when we think about a fraction, the numerator of a fraction tells a part, and then the denominator of the fraction tells what the whole is that we're talking about. So ratios and fractions are related, but they're not necessarily exactly the same thing. In fact, they're not at all the same thing, although a part to whole ratio can be thought of as a fraction. So let's look at some examples. So if we want to, let's take a moment to write some ratios here. If we want to write the ratio of hearts to stars, we have to look at this picture to see how many hearts are there. There are 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 hearts, and how many stars? I see 2 stars. So we would say the ratio of hearts to stars is 4 hearts and 2 stars. One way to write them is to put a colon between them, but before we do anything else, we also want to think about the idea that we can simplify those. Yes, there are 4 hearts and there are 2 stars, but we could also look at that and say, well, what that really means is we could simplify 4 and 2 both by 2, and so 4 divided by 2 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we can really simplify this to a ratio of 2 to 1. And what that means is for every 2 hearts, there's 1 star. And then if I look over at the other group, for every 2 hearts, there's 1 star. So I can simplify that ratio of 4 to 2 to a ratio of 2 to 1. And as I said before, there's three different ways rather that you can write these. 2 to 1 written using a colon, 2 to 1 written like a fraction, and 2 to 1 using the word 2. Now, a couple things to notice. It's very important that the 2 comes first and the 1 second, because we have to put our ratio in the order of the words we're using. So when we started out, hearts, there were 4 of them. Stars, there were 2 of them. So the ratio was 4 to 2, which simplified to 2 to 1. We can't switch them, the 4 and the 2 or the 2 and the 1, because then we would be changing the number of hearts and stars that we say we have. The other thing I want you to notice is, again, we can write ratios as fractions, but notice when we look at that fraction, 2 is the numerator. That tells what part of the group is hearts. 1 is the denominator. It tells what part of the group is stars. Remember, if we think about this, if we were to think about this as a fraction, it really doesn't make sense for it to be a fraction, because 1 would have to be the whole. Well, the 1 is not the whole, because the 1 represents the stars, and the stars are not the whole group. They're only a part of the group. Now that brings us to our idea of what type of ratio is this. This is a part-to-part ratio. Again, the reason it's a part-to-part ratio is because hearts are part of the group and stars are part of the group. Neither of them make up the whole group. Now, if we look at the ratio of stars to hearts, you might think it's the same, but no, it's not, because we've changed the order of the words, which is going to change the order of the numbers. The ratio of stars to hearts is 2 to 4. So for every 2 stars, there are 4 hearts. We could also simplify that and say for every 1 star, there are 2 hearts. So it could look like this, and it could also look like this. And this is also a part-to-part ratio, because the stars are part of the group and the hearts are part of the group. Neither of those represent the whole group. Our next one, moons to shapes. There are 2 moons. And then there are how many shapes? Well, if you look at this, Sometimes people might say, oh, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shapes. But remember, we have to also count the moon, and the moons are also shapes. So the ratio of moons to shapes is 2 to 8. So we could simplify that to a ratio of 1 to 4. For every one moon, there are 4 shapes. And the moons are a part of the group, and the shapes represent the whole group. So this is the one that actually is a little bit like a fraction. If you think about it, another way to say this is the moons are 1/4 of the whole group. That is the only kind of ratio. Part to whole ratios are the only ones that really make sense as fractions. So understand again, ratios and fractions are not the same thing, even though a part to whole ratio can be thought of as a fraction. All right, the ratio of stars to moons. In this case, there are 2 stars and 2 moons, so that ratio is 2 to 2. 2 to 2 can be simplified to a ratio of 1 to 1. And this is a part-to-part ratio because stars are part of the group and moons are part of the group. So part-to-part ratio. And our last group, moons to not moons. Well, there are 2 shapes up there that are moons, and if we look at the ones that are not moons, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 2 to 6, which 2 to 6, we can simplify 2 and 6 both by 2 to get a ratio of 1 to 3. And this, think about this for a minute, whether it's a part to part or part to whole. The moons represent part of the group, so part of the group are moons, and another part of the group are not moons. Sometimes people think this would be a part to whole because we're talking about the whole group being either moons or not moons. But when you look at it, it's only part of the group that is moons and part of the group that's not moons. The 2 parts do make up the whole group, but they are both just parts of a group. Okay, now that you've had a moment to kind of look at this, I want you to try some of these on your own and see how you can do. So take a look at these examples. Try these on your own. When you're try to match the ratios to the words, and then once you've done that, pause while you're doing that, and then once you've done that, go forward and see if you have them correct. And here are your correct answers. Now take a moment to see now if you know whether these are part to part or part to whole ratios. All right, now when you look at these, the only one that is a part to whole ratio is the very last one. This one is a part to whole ratio. All of the others are part to part. That last one, triangles are part of the group and shapes represent the whole group. Now the one before it, squares to not squares, yes, the whole group is either squares or not squares, but each of those 2 categories by themselves are each only a part of the whole. And the same thing for polygons and not polygons. The squares and the triangles are polygons. The circles are not polygons. So that's a part-to-part ratio. Hopefully this has given you a good introduction to ratios. Remember some of our key ideas. The idea is that ratios can be written 3 different ways. They can be simplified, and the order of the numbers is important. Also remember there are 2 kinds of ratios. There are part-to-part ratios, and there are part-to-whole ratios.